We can go ahead and get started with questions.
I actually have more of a comment on Eliza's paper. I remember having a similar experience when reading Sargon's campaign that led to the destruction of the temple at Wa'atu, and reading it as an art historian and looking at the monuments that were carried off and hacked apart, but barely being able to actually read the entire account because it was so bloody. And yes, stumbling over the fact that emotions are left out of history as we learn it as students, as it is being taught mostly. But I think your question is very relevant to the core of a question that has been raised a lot: at whom is this iconoclasm actually addressed? And by thinking about the emotions and who would have these emotions, I think we draw attention to this question and maybe can look at acts of iconoclasm in a better defined way. So I think your approach might actually help us be more clear about who is trying to do what to whom and who is, the victim here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, so based on all of your discussions, we have the important issue now of thinking about what to do about issues of repatriation. Obviously, we've seen certain items going back and what can happen to this, but obviously, Professor Simpson's discussion and Jason's earlier question, we don't know where outbreaks of iconoclasm may happen next. So what's our role of where these artifacts go, and then also thinking of sort of Claire's closing comments on this issue of meaning. People who want items repatriated want them because it has meaning to them, but that also gives them meaning for other people to want to destroy those objects, whereas we may say you're actually safer sending your meaningful objects somewhere else where people don't have such deep-seated attachment to them, and therefore less motivation to potentially destroy them. And how do we sort of balance out those issues?
Go ahead, Matt.
Take a half step. I think part of the issue develops because we have this notion of permanence that we attach to museums. Right? We think of museums as permanent places and permanent repositories, but as archaeologists, it's pretty evident over the broad span of time that these institutions are not going to be as permanent as we think they are, right? Which I think, to me, stresses the importance of the kinds of things Peter was talking about, and Joe touched on too, but in documenting the stuff that you have now while you have it, but also in the importance of using collections while you hold them, because you may not hold them forever. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to add that collections aren't necessarily safe anywhere. Disasters can happen. I mean, so I don't like the argument about not repatriating because of future damage across the board.
I mean, I guess from the example of the Parthenon particularly, this has been a huge debate historically, and you also get into the problem of curatorial practices as well and how they develop over time. What the British Museum first did when they received the Parthenon marbles would now be decried as hurting them, because they didn't know any better at the time. And so it's hard to make a judgment call on these matters, I'd say.
What? Greeks have built an argument for their return.
Yeah.
The New Parthenon Museum.
Yeah. With
the spaces left for the things that are going to come back to Britain. But this is fundamentally a political discussion. Really nothing to do with archaeology.
Liv had her hand up first.
Just as a comment, it's also, I just find it like just really highly ironic and also distasteful that some countries are rushing to give refugee status to cultural heritage that are also refusing to give refugee status to people.
Thank you.
And I think that kind
yes.
of pushes us also to like this point that kind of poses these questions that I think you were talking about also, is like, why do we care? Like, do we care more about, does it trigger more for us? Of course, these people don't need to they don't need to be integrated into our societies and so on and so forth, but I just find it really really problematic.
Just one more thought on the repatriation question. There's a troubling aspect of the repatriation of the Bastien case, for example, in that it's been cited by museums in many cases as reasons not to repatriate, because we'll give it back to them and it'll get blown up again. And I think that's troubling for a few reasons, but you know, traditionally we've seen the distribution of these objects through illicit means. And what I think we need to do is continue to distribute objects from different cultures around the world, but find a licit pathway for those things to move around and be shared. So that when there is destruction, we have Palmyrene statues in different museums around the world, but they weren't gotten by illicit means, they were shared legally.
Joe?
Bastien has had his hand up.
It's like 2 points I want to make. The first one is that those cultural items and this heritage has a very practical, material, pragmatic meaning for the local people. When you go upon your relatives, or I mean, we were just talking about that with LeeAnn. This has financial meaning, but also some importance on a daily life basis. So that's what we're talking about, like, you know, taking away from them, and we need to keep that into consideration when we address the question of meaning, because there's clearly a discussion to have about how to hierarchize there's a hierarchy when it comes to claims of, you know, who owns the right to decide the fate of this particular item, and local people have, and also it's problematic when you include the World Heritage concept, but let's focus on this for now. It means something very important for the local people. And the second point I want to make, which is also very close to what Joe said before, is that the destruction of cultural heritage in this like, war contexts, or looting in this unrest or civil war areas, only accounts for a small part of the destruction that occurs across the world. And it's very hypocritical of us to focus exclusively on this aspect and forget how bad, you know, urban planning or just poor cultural heritage management is destroying entire collections and sites on a very regular basis in most countries around the world, including the USA, including France. So that's things to keep in mind.
Yep, go ahead.
So actually, several different points. First of all, I think Liv's observation is exactly wrong. It's spot on. That we're talking about people more than, we should be concerned more with people than with things. The irony is that economic development is for people. Everybody wants better roads, a higher standard of living, and that's what's having a greater impact on cultural heritage globally overall. What archaeologists need is a place at the table to help make those decisions and not find out later that, oh, the bulldozers hit another tune. On the question of, you know, are things safer here than there? Well, there was a quite licit division of finds from the excavations in northern Syria back before the First World War, and some of those finds went to Germany, where they were bombed to smithereens during the Second World War. Now, using technology, the Germans have put them back together, every little fish-sized shard of these statues. Sometime in the future, it might be possible to do the same thing at Nimrud. Well, we don't know. Maybe ISIS has dumped the fragments in the river. But we don't know that any one place is going to be safer than any other. And there was this absurdity at the time the Bastien Buddhas were endangered, that somehow rich museums in the West were going to ransom them, basically pay off the Taliban so that they wouldn't blow them up. This is completely wrong here. I mean, unless the owning countries, the countries in which these antiquities actually exist, are socially, politically, and economically capable of managing their antiquities, we're going to have this situation continually. But that's an argument for more development, not for more museums in the West.
All right, other thoughts on that, or do we have more questions? Yes.
Yeah, so along the lines of the economic development, that kind of leads to this weird idea that the way we hijacked China and their course in history with capitalism, I mean, why make the trade in antiquities illicit? Why not just buy them all so people will start digging up the Middle East, and then they won't even be listening to Daesh anymore? I don't know, it's crazy. But like Joseph said, why are we not thinking about the people? You know, we're thinking more about objects than people.
I think we're thinking about both.
Well, we're
Deep,
not talking
profoundly.
about
No, we are. I mean, I think all of the talks have spoken to the question of when we destroy, when people do things with images, they do that for the sake of other people, whether it's to intimidate them, to make themselves feel better, as LeeAnn pointed out, as a threat to ISIS. When Jabhat Nusra destroys a tomb, they're like, look, we're coming for you. It is fundamentally about people.
It's not in the media, and I blame the media in part for our focus on the spectacular over the everyday. If we had average everyday Syrians on TV telling us about their plight, as we have begun to have with the refugee crisis, and we've begun to see those stories finally, how many years into the conflict are we? And we're finally seeing Syrian people on TV talking about what their experience has been like. That has been missing from the media coverage. And instead we've been recycling images of temple destruction.
What's the stat that's been coming out? Only perhaps 30% of members of Daesh have sort of joined willingly. Is added.
Can you speak now?
Oh, I think the new stat coming out is that perhaps only 30% of Daesh joined willingly, and the news stories that you're mentioning have spoken to the fact that there are, well, they remind us of LeeAnn's presentation earlier that there are many different groups here. We're talking about many different audiences, even within these larger, seemingly homogenous groups that we label with one convenient term.
Absolutely. James?
I agree that faced with a person and an object, we have an ethical duty to respect the person first. But I might just pose that this way of putting it, we have to respect people rather than objects, is a little bit reductive, because the objects are themselves standing in a metonymic relationship with given histories, that by association they are the history of a given people. They're what ties them to their past most intimately. So, you know, it's more complex than just people and objects.
It's not a perfect equation.
It's not a perfect equation.
It's coming from one of only 2 countries in Europe who gives refugee status, or have up until like 2 weeks ago given fairly free refugee status to Syrians, while the rest of the European countries who are now making big gestures about saving the cultural heritage, like France, it still feels a little bit, I think that there is still a really distasteful dynamic that is going on. You know, that you can make this big gesture and kind of save the cultural heritage, but you cannot give refugee status to, I don't know, 100,000 people.
I think we're all
Yeah,
horrified
no,
at the
I know,
plight of
but,
the
you know,
refugees.
I think
Yeah.
it is really